politics influence our identities. The hybridity of cultures and values, identity, is becoming an increasingly contentious topic. Identity politics is a term coined by the Combahee River Collective, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in 1977, and refers to a political approach in which a person or people of a particular religion, race, social background, class, and other identifying factors will form exclusive sociopolitical alliances, and these identifying factors will be an influential factor in their political outlook and therefore moving away from broad and partisan politics. It is often broadly associated with the left of the political spectrum and is often sneered at by nationalist politics. However, many have also pointed out that nationalist politics are also a form of identity politics. It is only that the identity that is being foregrounded is one that supported the mainstream discourse of the nation, whereas identity politics, in its origins and more popular definition, is one that claims to align itself with the identities of minorities. How much of that do you agree to? How much of that do you not accept? Well, that's up to you. But if you want to share your opinions, you can do so on 0208-687-7878. Here with us to talk a little bit more about this topic is Professor Mary Bernstein. She's a professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut, and she publishes broadly in the fields of social movements, politics, race, gender, and law. Professor Mary Bernstein, good afternoon, peace upon you, and welcome to the Drive Time Show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us today, first of all. If I can ask, identity politics was a term first coined by activists with disabilities as a way to transform perceptions about people with disabilities. How do you think has this term evolved over the years, and to what result?
Thanks. So in my earlier work, I stated that there were two main lines of critique of what had been termed identity politics. And the first critique was that it ignores issues related to exploitation, to social class, to poverty, to globalization, all of which exacerbate economic inequality. The flip side of the critique, and this is the second critique, is to see identity politics as somehow engaging in narrow reformist strategies that seek narrow rights and recognition based on an identity, as opposed to seeking radical cultural change that's somehow transformational in nature. And I think that these critiques of identity politics really continue to this day, and in public discourse, it's often used as a derogatory way to dismiss politics that people don't like. Instead, I prefer to think more sociologically about the relationship between identity and politics. And that way we can understand that identity is linked to institutional structures, to the political economy, and it's also cultural, because political and institutional structures are constituted by meaning systems that justify specific political and economic arrangements. So, for example, in the U.S. case, we can only understand the legacy of institutional racism if we understand the racist stereotypes that are used to justify systems of inequality. We also need to understand that exploitation takes gender and race-specific forms. And so when we're thinking about politics, we need to think about both of these, and that, in fact, both political economy, class-based inequality, and identity reinforce each other dialectically.
Professor Bernstein, you mentioned America as an example. And I just want to kind of bring it to what's happening today in America with the Black Lives Matter movement. I sometimes wonder, when I listen to all these protests, the people who are themselves maybe, call it racists or people who are anti-Black Lives movement, are they not themselves victims of identity crisis where they actually believe in the superiority of the race they belong to? And they themselves having this crisis of identity, and how does one break that cycle to get in there to say, look, this is the reality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really the critical question, because you're right. I think what we have to really fundamentally understand is that, is that the wealthy, people who are in power, use racism as a way to divide the poorer classes.
Yes, definitely.
And they've been doing that historically, right? We can think about, the Strange Career of Jim Crow, the book by C. Vann Woodward, which basically argued that after emancipation, the legal institution of Jim Crow, which was what was called separate but equal, even though it was never equal, essentially what that did was it threw a bone to poor whites and said, okay, you're worried about competition from people who were formerly enslaved, and so what we're going to do is make sure that those people who were formerly enslaved don't have access to education, that they can't live in the same places. And what happened was racism was used to divide the poorer classes, and so it kept, what it did was it essentially gave poor whites a way to say, oh, well, we think we're better than this other group, and we have maybe slightly better economic opportunities as a result. And then that left, of course, African Americans impoverished with little opportunity. And what it did was it essentially helped to maintain the power of the wealthy and to help facilitate the increasing concentration of power. And we see that today. Right, we see, so it's not identity politics that distracts, but it's the racism and the deliberate efforts by people in power that keep the poorer classes divided. And so we see that in the rise of Donald Trump. We see that in the Tea Party that came before him. And so, yes, absolutely, it keeps people it keeps people divided, and it keeps them in line.
Mary, thank you for that. That's really great stuff. But I just wanted to keeping the theme with Black Lives Matters and also going back in history in a way. How much of this is stemming from the slave trade, and we're seeing it today?
Oh, it's directly linked. There have been a lot of studies that show, if you look at, post-emancipation and you look at federal housing policies, you look at de jure segregation, right, which basically created these areas of entrenched poverty that made it impossible for Black Americans to move into the suburbs, to own their own homes, and therefore they were not able to accumulate wealth in the same way that white people were. And so you can literally look at those areas that were redlined, and those are the same areas today where we see entrenched poverty, where we see a lack of economic opportunity, and where we see police violence. And then that police violence helps to maintain that system and that segregation. And not only, and this is what I'm arguing in some of my current work, not only because of police brutality, but the police also fail to protect, right? The police should be there to serve the citizens. And by not protecting, it makes areas that are poor also have violent crime that's simply unaddressed. And then when police go in and they brutalize, all they do is they destroy any trust between communities of color and the police, and then nobody turns to the police. And so the police become, rather than an ally and rather than, servants who should be working for the people, they become part of the oppressive system, and that decimates communities. And that's why this movement is so important.
Mary, looking forward to what you've just said, education seems, or I think, is the only way forward to, until people are educated, they're not really going to learn. Sometimes I challenge myself thinking, in a sense, but education has always been systematically people of, as you mentioned, people who are from a less economic backgrounds. They've been deprived of correct education, hence why they have this belief system. So is it realistic to think that education is going to be part of a solution?
Education is it's absolutely part of the solution, but we need to think about what's going to foster education. The way education is funded in the U.S. is often by property tax, and what that means is if you live in these areas that have been, historically oppressed, and there's very low home ownership rate, there's not much money for those schools. If the environment is dangerous and people are afraid to send they're afraid for their kids when they go to school, whether it's afraid of community gun violence or afraid of police violence. That has adverse health effects. When you're anxious and when you're scared, kids can't learn, right? And if you don't have that economic opportunity, if you don't have the belief that you can actually have the opportunity to achieve, that also has ill health effects. And then those carry on. And so there's a lot that needs to happen in order for education to work. And reducing police violence, having alternative ways of promoting public safety are really critical, because if you have safety, then all kinds of anti-poverty efforts, including education, can take place.
All right. Hanif, any questions?
Yeah, thanks for that. So fascinating. It's kind of, when we spoke about the police force and what their purpose has been for many years, and it's got to a point where they feel that they are not being supported by the police, do you feel that one of the criteria for Black Lives Matter is to stop funding the police force is the right approach to what from what they're seeing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's the phrase defund the police, I think, is a really tricky phrase. I think it's very catchy. But I think if you dig a little deeper, most people don't mean take away all the money or have no public servants who are charged with public safety. What it does mean is to think very carefully about how funding is allocated. So, for example, in the U.S., there's been a tremendous amount of money spent on militarizing the police. And it's not the way that your own citizens. And so instead of, say, arresting everyone, there are in fact a lot of community-driven strategies that reduce community gun violence, which is in certain areas quite high. And we see this right now in Chicago. We've seen it in Minnesota. We see it in Hartford, where I am. And these are proven, and what they need is they need less policing, not more policing. They need prevention. They need diversion to community organization people rather than, say, arresting them on low-level drug charges. We need funding for community-based violence interrupter groups, who literally, these are people who are out on the streets. They're not police officers. They don't carry guns. They don't have badges. They're out there every night, and they are working to prevent violence. They're working to see what is the problem. Why is it that people are out there possibly in danger themselves or in danger of committing gun violence? Why are they out there, and what can we do to change and to help? And that's far more cost effective than pouring money into police tactics that indiscriminately target people merely because they are African American or Latinx. Right. And so if we strategically reallocate funding and we put more funding in, and these strategies, there's a lot of empirical data to suggest that they reduce the problem and that you can actually foster cooperative relations with communities of color and law enforcement to reduce incarceration and arrest.
Thanks for that.
Professor Bernstein, one last question, if you allow. Some of the critics, they say that if you're aiming for the identity politics, then you're actually creating a gap. So it breeds division, because if everyone tries to, or it starts to identify with those that they share similarities with, you have fractions in between, and also it strips you of your identity, of your not identity but individuality, of your autonomy. What do you think about that?
Could you rephrase that? I want to make sure I'm understanding properly.
Okay. So, I mean, if you look at the pros and cons regarding identity politics, some have criticized, or some critics have said that it actually breeds division in society. I mean, if everyone begins to identify with those that they share similarities with, then you have a gap between different people of society, something that you probably don't want. And it also strips that person of their autonomy, of their individuality, that they actually come with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important, and I think that's a critique that has been raised. I'm not sure that there's an easy answer. I think what we need to recognize is that politics, oppression, domination are complex, and that if we take, say, economic inequality, right, we can recognize that the concentration of wealth in the hands of the 1% has become even more pronounced than it was in the past, right? And so you can argue that we all, that the other 99%, this is something Occupy Wall Street tried to argue, really need to band together to work to challenge that. However, we also need to recognize that there are racially specific ways that this class-based domination takes place, right? And I think, again, like police brutality, the concentration of Black and brown people in poor communities, that those are particular manifestations. And so the trick becomes, how do we create a broad enough politics that both recognizes the oppression, especially the class oppression of, certainly the poorer classes, but increasingly of even segments of the middle class, as we see a big decline in the middle class in the U.S. How do we bring them together in a way that both recognizes racially specific forms of oppression, but also acknowledges who the real, I'm trying to think of a word other than enemy, but who has the power, right? And so if you blame immigrants, if you blame people of color, if you're a poor white person, and those are the people that you're blaming for your own economic dislocation, you're looking in the wrong place, and you're essentially allowing those with power to play on your fear of racialized others. And so the trick is, how do we make common cause with other, with poor whites who are also often economically dislocated, but don't have those racially specific forms of racial and class oppression, right? Because they're very susceptible to, the politics of racial resentment and to, thinking that, well, the real problem is immigration, as opposed to, say, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a very elite few. And I don't know that I honestly can have a good answer for that, except that we need to keep talking about that, and we need to really understand that there is a sort of general class-based exploitation, and that's getting worse. And we need to think about really, where does the solution lie, and how does that oppression take specific and pernicious, racially specific forms.
All right. Professor of Sociology at the University of Connecticut, Professor Mary Bernstein, with us on the line. Thank you very much for your time. Great to talk to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Peace be upon you.